post-mortem book, Mortality. He wrote this as he, in the last year of his life. And on the panel will be Carol Blue, his widow. They were married for 20, 25 years or so, along with Kerry Goldstein, his publisher, and his good friends, Martin Amos and Robert Weil. This panel is just being introduced, and we're going to bring this to you live. But I want to remind you, Carol Blue will be joining us right after this panel, and we're taking social media comments for her. So if you have any comments you'd like to make about Christopher Hitchens or any questions for Carol Blue, you can do that via email, Twitter, and Facebook. Email booktv@cspan.org. Twitter @booktv is our handle. And finally on Facebook, facebook.com/booktv. Now here is the panel beginning on Christopher Hitchens.
Today we have a full house, and of course we want to conduct this in a way that everybody will be able to enjoy this. So at the end of the authors presenting, we will have a Q&A session. And I ask that if you would like to ask a question, that you approach the mic that's in the middle aisle, that you ask your question, and then please, if you would just go back to your seat so that we can have a good flow of Q&A going there. Your cell phones, if you would please turn them off, and any other electronic devices, and everyone will be able to enjoy it. Let me also recognize the sponsors of Miami Book Fair International, Florida Blue, American Airlines, Target, and many, many more sponsors that have given of themselves and their corporations and their money to help make this a community event that enriches all of us here in Miami-Dade County. And I know that many of you have come from outside of our community. Can I see a show of hands? Those who do not live in Miami-Dade County and are visiting. Wonderful. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Let's give them a round of applause. It's great to have you here in this wonderful city, the magic city of Miami, and welcome to Miami Book Fair International and Miami-Dade College. Without further ado, I'm going to bring on an individual who will be the introducer of our authors today, and he is Ariel Gonzalez. He's a professor here at Miami-Dade College. He's also a book critic for the Miami Herald, and he wears many, many more hats. Please welcome Ariel Gonzalez.
Good afternoon. One of the last pieces Christopher Hitchens completed was a review of a biography of G.K. Chesterton. The unapologetic atheist had much in common with the Christian apologist. They were both prolifically outspoken, sharp-tongued bon vivants who read whole libraries and wrote with irresistibly quotable style. In his thriller, The Man Who Was Thursday, Chesterton describes a character thusly. He seemed like a walking blasphemy, a blend of the angel and the ape. The same can be said of Mr. Hitchens, whose hybrid nature, its seemingly irreconcilable highs and lows, defied easy characterization, often to the consternation of his many friends and foes. But alas, he is gone. Next month marks the first anniversary of his death. Today, we've assembled a panel to discuss Mr. Hitchens' posthumous work, Mortality, a collection of essays that describes his experience. He would have hated calling it a struggle or battle with stage 4 esophageal cancer. Kerry Goldstein was Hitchens' publisher. In addition to Mortality, he has reissued 3 of Mr. Hitchens' infamous screeds: No One Left to Lie To, his indictment of Bill Clinton, The Trials of Henry Kissinger, and The Missionary Position, which exposes the lies of that thieving, fanatical Albanian dwarf, Mother Teresa. Carol Blue is Mr. Hitchens' widow. They were married for over 20 years. She contributed the love leaf afterword to Mortality. Like her husband, she inspires without succumbing to sentiment. And Martin Amis, most of you recognize him. Quite frankly, one of the best writers in the world. His latest novel is Lionel Aspo, State of England. But he was also Christopher Hitchens' best friend, a brother in all but DNA. About their 40-year-long friendship, he once said, "It was always bright and sunny, always May, even when it ended on that sad December day." Please welcome our guests.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. Very impressive turnout. Americans are like the U.S. mail. Not rain, not snow, nor gloom of night can prevent these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. I'd like to begin with an anecdote about Christopher. I put him in a novel called The Pregnant Widow. And I put him in on the basis of one thing he said, a sort of a witticism of his, and then had to incorporate him into the novel because I couldn't bear to leave this out. But the basis of the incident is we were having dinner in one of our favorite restaurants, which we always refer to as the restaurant that's only big enough for one person. A tiny place. And we were about to get going when this was in 1975, when two young men came into the restaurant in wasted suits with long hair, but prosperous. They were sort of upper-class hippies, basically. And they began to sort of whisper among themselves and asking the waiter questions. And they were obviously going to have a big party come to the restaurant. They were making arrangements for this. And it went on, and Christopher and I couldn't get talking because it was such a distraction. And Christopher was saying, "Christ," every now and then. And they had the air of young men who didn't work for a living, but patiently awaited the deaths of elderly relatives. Then one of them came up to us, and it was pretty clear what he was going to do. He was going to ask us to move tables. And he came up and he crouched, and after a flirtatious pause, he looked up, pouted through his fringe. And this had obviously he'd had many successes in this way of bending others to his will. The pout, the fringe, it had all gone like a dream before. And he pouted up at Christopher and me, and he said, "You're going to hate us for this." And Christopher said, "We hate you already." Yeah. They sent over a terrified bottle of Valpolicella about half an hour later. I've said and written that the extraordinary thing about Christopher really is the extent to which he was loved. Not just by us, but by you. And for a very sort of naughty essayist, this is quite a distinction. And I've often wondered why it is so. And one must not discount superficial reasons, because we do love people for superficial reasons as well as for profound reasons. But I'd have thought his terrific good looks had something to do with it. Yeah. As the phrase we like from Lolita, where Humbert says, "My striking, if perhaps somewhat brutal, good looks." But Christopher's weren't brutal, but they were very sort of telegenic, photogenic, and mnemogenic, very memorable looks. Also the perfect voice he had. which was without sort of Ponzi intonations, unlike my own. But it was the sense of danger summed up in that little story about him. And also the fact that he always seemed to be conducting a deeper argument with himself. And peculiarly, the result of this was that he made intellection very dramatic. I don't know why that should be quite, because he didn't deal in common sense. That was not his beat. And there are plenty of people who can do common sense, and that wasn't Christopher's thing. It was saying something that went against the grain and then having to justify it, so that the Hitch was really debating with Christopher half the time. And I think everyone sensed this, and everyone was excited by it.
Well, yes, Martin, I think the empire building good looks were part of it. And the argument with himself, he was always trying to refine his arguments by arguing with others. That's true. And he was hysterically funny. I don't know how one conveys that, though, in the telling.
I remember meeting Christopher for the first time in Washington while he was correcting galley proofs for God Is Not Great. And as you might imagine, I was extremely anxious about introducing myself. And for all the public pugilistic posturings that Christopher's infamous for, he was in fact disarmingly sweet, polite, generous, quick to laugh, and never made a young man in publishing feel that he had to impress him in any way. And he was much less interested in what somebody knew than how they thought, definitely interested in whether or not I could make him laugh. And he was just a very kind and appreciative writer, and I've been lucky to work with some fantastic people, but there is no single writer or person I've worked with in publishing who made the impression on me that Christopher did. And I could just say, you know, on behalf of 12, that this is absolutely the most personal book we've ever published, and I'm incredibly proud to be affiliated with it in any way.
You're right to stress his sort of graceful manners. He did have beautiful manners, and it was a reminder that in manners begins morality. It's not nothing manners. It's not a layer on the person. It's the beginning of actually empathetic feeling. And he was very democratic, and he wasn't looking over anyone's shoulder for the most famous person in the room. He talked to the person he talked to as an equal. But again, always the possibility of something abrasive, and that was very stimulating.
But it was always deliberate. If he was abrasive or argumentative or even somewhat cruel in his riposte, he meant to do it.
Yeah, but it was a sort of habit of his to say something that made people jolt back somewhat. Another story that I like very much is I was playing tennis with a psychohistorian, Robert J. Lifton, author of The Nazi Doctors and many other books. And Christopher joined us at the tennis court just as we were finishing. Needless to say, Christopher wasn't going to play tennis. And Bob Lifton had just beaten me 6-love, and he was 23 years, and still is 23 years older than me. So he was feeling very pleased with himself. And as he toweled himself down, having been introduced to Christopher, feeling very vigorous and manly, he said, there are so few, he said, quite typically, he said, there are so few areas of transcendence left open to us in these times. There's sex, there's sports, there's art, And Christopher said, "Oh, and don't forget the miseries of others," he said. the languid contemplation of the miseries of others, that this should be a transcendent pleasure, I thought was quite daring.
Well, also, I think he just said it in the way Oscar Wilde might say something, because he wished everyone well. He was the least competitive, most generous person, really, I've ever met. So I think he would really wallow in the happiness of others. It just was a good line.
Yeah.
We spent quite a bit of time traveling together for the various books that we were able to work on. Would you pass that? And you spend a lot of time on the road with somebody. You're in cars, you're in trains, you're on planes, and there's a lot of downtime, and you begin to talk about your life. And Christopher was performing. He was working, and he understood what his job was, and what he was traveling for. And so you'd speak, and I didn't think for a second that he had heard a single thing I'd said to him. And then 3 months later, he would bring up the most specific thing that I had said when he wasn't listening. I didn't think he was listening. But people talk about his memory, but it wasn't just for words on the page. I mean, it was really for every detail of an interaction and specific questions about my life, which I couldn't imagine.
As much as it might seem hard to believe, that's because he cared.
Yeah. He did. He did. You couldn't get through an airport because every single person who would stop to say hello or to ask for an autograph, he would stop what he was doing and look them in the eye and ask them about themselves and how they knew who he was.
Martin, what do you think he would think of this love fest we're presenting so far?
No more than is due, I think. And he loved all this, any kind of interaction with his readers, as we all do, and he came to be quite addicted to it. And I was walking to a cinema with him. It was our habit to go and see the most violent or horrific film available. And on this occasion in Southampton in Long Island, we were pathetically reduced to Wesley Snipes. And I said to him as we were walking to the cinema, I said, "No one's recognized you for 10 minutes. And he said, 15 minutes. And I said, do you mind? I mean, either way. And he said, yeah, I get more and more pissed off, he said, when they don't come up and salute me, and I can't have a chat with them. And he said, what do they know? What do they care? What do they feel if they don't recognize the hitch? And that use of the third person, referring himself in the third person, was typical. And it doesn't always go with perfect mental health.
Almost never.
For instance, I said, "You're very famous in Cyprus." And he said, "Yes, because I'm a great friend of the Cypriot people." And I said, "And is it in the press when you come to Cyprus?" He said, "Yeah, it says on the front page, Hitch flies in." And I said, "What does it say when you leave?" It says, Hitch flies out. But on this occasion, the stroll to the cinema, we got to the cinema without him being recognized. And then there was an old elderly party sitting on a hydrant. And as we approached, he sort of woke up, and I could tell he was going to say something. And I thought, we're going to be late for the film, because Hitch will want 10 minutes with this old guy. But as we came past him, he just said, "Do you love us or do you hate us?" he said, meaning Americans. He wasn't speaking for himself and his wife. He meant Americans. And Hitch slid into the cinema behind the doors, and as he was going in, he said, "Depends on how you behave," he said. And I always thought a great remark, and sort of perfect, and he didn't linger. But it suggests a more logical kind of person than he was. And I don't think he did judge everything in utilitarian ways. I think he was, the Iraq thing is the most famous, but he had definitely perverse streak. He supported Ralph Nader in 2000, and Bush Cheney in 2004.
Well, barely. I
Yeah.
can set the record straight on that.
Yeah, sort of, but that was his position.
But also, Martin, I mean, if you want to get into a rap.
No, but all I'm saying is that
Yeah, because you're making a different point.
I am. I'm just saying that there's sort of a perverse imp in him, and he obeys the imp. And then what he loves is justifying it,
Yeah.
sort of ex post facto. And no one on earth wanted him to debate him on any of these topics, because he could beat Cicero plus Demosthenes in debate. Absolutely terrifying speaker, not just perfect sentences, but perfect paragraphs and perfect paragraph sequence. But anyway, I'm just saying that he's an odd fish, an odd bird, and he's not. That was what was so stimulating about him.
We just saw Mitchell Kaplan, who that owner of Books and Books, runs the book fair, and Mitchell remembered an event we did for God Is Not Great in Miami at Temple Emmanuel, and there were 1,000 people. Some of you may have actually been there. And Christopher was not in debate with one person. He was in debate with a rabbi, an evangelical Christian, a Buddhist nun, a doctor of Islamic thought, and one other person who I can't recall. And each of them made their case, and Christopher would get up and offer his rebuttal. The doctor of Islamic thought happened also to be in a wheelchair. And so after Christopher finished sort of systematically taking down each of his opponents, he then looked at the crowd and he said, "Surely you must be thinking, he can't go after the woman in the wheelchair. But I assure you, you are wrong."
The nun.
The nun.
It's been pointed out often that by Christopher, that he would probably have lived longer if he'd had a less good constitution. Although about his untimely death, I always say that, in fact, he died at the age of about 75, because his love of life was so great that he never went to sleep. So his day was, a third longer than ours. Sorry.
Yeah, that cheers me up a bit, except if you think, well, what if he had kept barely sleeping and lived to 90?
I know. But, I mean, he would metaphorically drink you under the table. And then while you staggered off and smashed your head open on the bathroom floor and got into bed, emerged covered in blood 12 hours later, going sort of, dear, oh, dear, 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 and thinking how many days is this hangover going to last, he would come down having written a 5,000-word piece of incredible quality. Mm-hmm. And you had to think that he was, in fact, of a sort of different species. It was not human, what he could do after that kind of punishment.
There's a lot of myth-making and legend-making with certain kinds of writers like Christopher, but the problem is that everything you hear is only half as fast and as good as he was. It was really something. It was literally a 5,000-word story on deadline at 4 in the morning, turned in at 7. Sure. And he didn't like people to know that. In fact, he often, in the old days when he used to send by fax, because I've known him that long, he used to write the piece, then come back and join the company after dinner and just leave it on the fax machine and wait and send it the next morning, because he didn't want them to know how the time it took between when they called and assigned it and when he had written it, which was usually about 30 minutes.
There's a special sort of breed of people, and I'm thinking of Anthony Burgess and John Updike. And it's been some amateur psychologist wrote of Burgess, I think, that they have pressure on the cortex, these people, where there's eloquence is pressing down on them, and they have to sort of release it as an underground well would release a spurt of water. That it's that they can't not do it. And John Updike wrote 100 books in his life. and the prose of a fantastic quality. And you just have to, bow out and hold their coat while they do that. You can't compete with it.
But he was also surprisingly, when he would deliver, whether it was a manuscript or I gather his essays as well for various publications, sort of objective about it. He'd turn in his piece, and there might be one or two things that he would aggressively fight for, but was sort of turn it over and let you do what there was nothing to do, really.
There was nothing to do, but if, often his editors say we need to cut, 1,000 words for ad, perfume, or whatever it might be, he would just say, okay, and he'd find 1,000 words and get rid of it.
Well, I think
he's completely open to suggestion. Not to say he didn't value his work and he was a hack. It's just that was part of the craft and the work of having signed up for a certain publication.
Well, you and I have spoken before about putting together Arguably, and there was this period of time where you and Christopher and Steve Wasserman were collecting these pieces from the past 10 or 12 years, and of course it came in, it would have been 1,600 pages.
Yeah, it was far too much.
And he was completely sort of agnostic about what we could get rid of or what we could keep, and he was very comfortable with whatever we needed to do. You were less so.
Yeah, I hated seeing all those pieces being thrown out of the... It was fine with him.
But it's astonishing to look back on that collection and think about the breadth of subjects that he was interested in and just how wide-ranging his work was.
Yeah, he would write. Well, for example, for Vanity Fair, he wrote the entire text to the Vanity Fair Hollywood book, not knowing who half these stars were till he read their files. He would write about starlets for them at the last minute. And then he would write a long essay on Philip Larkin or Auden or the Chesterton that was mentioned, which he wrote in the ICU of the MD Anderson Hospital Center.
Don't forget fashion
extraordinary
makeovers.
range. Or it could be P.G. Wodehouse or James Bond or...
Yeah. We should...
Or Hegel or Marx.
We should, not to be morbid, but we should talk about his courage and the fact that his good manners, his sincere good manners, never deserted him. And you'd be sitting at his bedside in this hellish hospital in Houston, in the hospital district of Houston, and people would come in every half an hour, every 20 minutes to do something horrible to him, and he never lost his grace. But it stays with me that he was physically very brave. He's a physically brave man. And we'd often be in desperately menacing pubs in London, under Piccadilly Circus, say, and there would be some muttering and then a confrontation with sort of 5 very useful-looking young men of no great education. And I would be saying, "Come on, Christopher," and he would never take a step back. And he would arrive. And he arrived one evening at Ian McEwan's, and Ian tells this story, slightly rolling his eyes. But Hitch arrived, and Ian said, "Here you are. Let's have a drink." And Christopher said, "No, come on." He said, "There's a man roughing up a woman at the other end of the square. Come on, let's go and deal with that." And you've got several stories.
Yeah, he did that. There was a woman being roughed out in front of our apartment, and he ran down and ran out and saved her. And I was, I wasn't sure I was too happy about it. And he wasn't doing it to show off or to prove he was a hero. He was actually trying to help the poor woman.
Well, Carol, you've said before. I mean, it's that same courage that allowed Christopher to write so candidly about his own ordeal over those 18 months, and you've spoken, and maybe you want to speak a little bit now about sort of what relationship his work as a foreign correspondent has to the work he did in Mortality.
Well, I was thinking about it. There are 2 aspects of it. One, he went to many, many dangerous zones over the course of his journalistic career, and had a number of near misses. Notably, there was the time he was in Afghanistan and he had his white suit and a bag of books and decided to go off to a city outside of Kabul, and suddenly realized he was standing in the square and he was in the middle of a fight between two warlords, and bullets were flying and bombs were exploding and no one was on the street. And he had a little card that he'd been given by the American embassy, and he called that number, and someone from the military came and rescued him. There was another time where he almost lost his life driving Route 66 for Vandy Fair in a red Corvette, and they gave him a sat phone for that because he was terrified on the roads of America by himself. I later met up with him, and his tire blew out, and that was the closest he came to dying. But I could literally give you 50 stories from the Romanian Revolution to what was, when he was in it then called Zaire and so on, where he was in war zones or tricky situations and almost lost his life. And then he also covered areas of the world where a few people had been, North Korea. Many people had been in Iran, but at the time that he went to Tehran, it was pretty much off limits in the places he went, and so on. And what I realized is, he had been this foreign correspondent who traveled to places not many people went, and came back, and he was able to bring a very unique perspective and bring his writing, his humor, his take on these faraway lands. And then when he became ill, he basically traveled to this land of malady, as he put it, almost as if he were a foreign correspondent, reporting like a foreign correspondent on this new land he had arrived in. And though becoming very, very ill and having a potentially terminal disease or even having cancer is commonplace, the land he traveled to and the foreign correspondent that he became in covering, and I think makes it a very unique perspective on this illness.
Yeah, I mean, he always had his wit and sometimes needed it to get out of, or boldness and brilliance to get out of difficult situations. A couple of months after September the 11th, he was in Afghanistan, Peshawar, I think, and he got out of his car, taxi, because he saw some Osama bin Laden T-shirts on display, and he wanted to buy some for his friends, so he bought half a dozen, and then as he was doing this transaction, the mosque opened, and 500 furious young zealots, and also an element of all this is very sexually frustrated young men, came pouring out of the mosque and surrounded him. And he said, in a foul atmosphere of sort of fanatical arousal. And one of them pointed to Osama bin Laden, his image on the T-shirt, and he said, what do you think of, you like Osama bin Laden? And I know that I would have said something like, well, I quite like him. I don't always approve of him, but Christopher said, he said, Osama bin Laden is my brother. And they said, he's your brother? And Christopher said, all men are my brothers. Now, if you'll excuse me, please. And just right.
Yeah.
But in writing about his illness, I think what's striking about mortality, many people have written about illness and death and dying, but there's nothing in the book that's saccharine or there are no false notes. And I think that the responses I've heard from the people who've read this book was one of great sort of, it was very affirming. I mean, it's a very positive book, and as sad a book as it is, I think the honesty in it is sort of inspiring to people. What was fascinating to me also, and I'd love to hear your take on this, is how the writing changes over the course of the book. And in the beginning, he's got this sort of very distant, sort of objective look at what's happening, and it's sort of clinical in some ways, and he's reporting on his illness. And as his illness advances and the book moves on, and as his body begins to have limitations, he begins to write from the body in a way that I hadn't seen quite as much. It wasn't called for in much of the reporting he was doing, but it became sort of very visceral and very physical writing because he was limited by these things, by phlegm by things like this. And it's really stunning to watch this happen over the course of the book, and so clear-eyed about it.
But I mean, I think when he was writing it, because this, this book doesn't have a logical end, he was going to write a different book with a different ending, was the hope. He always thought this was just another interregnum on the road to at least a long remission, if not a cure. And the other thing is, I think you're right about how kind of visceral and physical his descriptions become. But Martin, even though he might have been sitting in a hospital bed or the nurses were coming in, he was still keeping up his side of the conversation. He was still the life of the party, the fizz in the gin, the cherry on top, really. Yeah. And sort of the great host to all the visitors who came through. And it was the place you wanted to be because that's where he was. You'd rather be in that hospital room with Christopher, and you'd be having as good and interesting and profound a time as you might anywhere else on this planet. Better to be there with him than, say, at a bar at the Bel Air Hotel. Yeah. Don't you think that's... Yes. I'm not kind of...
No, you're not.
Revisiting that?
No. One of his favorite, time-filling kind of tags was what could be more agreeable. And who could be more agreeable than Hitch, the best company on earth. But I don't know if I've said this to you, Carol, but I've certainly said it before, that one thing that happens, I always thought his love of life was superior to mine, and I sort of respected it, slightly envied it. But when he died, and I hope this is universal, when a loved friend dies, it seems to me that they bequeath to you their love of life. And certainly for many months after his death, the world looked sort of tingly with, it was, no doubt, sort of survivor hallucination and guilt and all that. But it sort of tingled, and you have a solemn, sacred duty to love life with the intensity they did because they can no longer do it.
Yeah, I'm a major lover of life, and I see no need for mortality, one of my arguments with Christopher. But I had that, you had told me that, and I had that experience. And I also had a kind of retrospective regret that I hadn't been even more life-loving and vital, even though I'm pretty keen on life. Yeah. But it does, you sort of think you owe it to them, but I don't think we'll ever measure up, which is not a condemnation of our ability to live life to its fullest and love it. It's just the fact that he was just so extraordinarily good at it.
Yeah.
Could we have some time for questions?
Sure. Do you have a question or two?
Well, no, let's just open up to these people. If you do have a question, please go to the mics, or the mic.
Am I talking too close to the mic?
Go ahead.
Yes. I was always quite grateful to him for going after Kissinger like he did. But his need to be contrary, to be the bad boy, seems to me to have overridden his good sense. Did he ever show any contrition, regret for teaming up with a bully boy like Bush?
I don't think he never was contrary just so that he could continue this image that you suggest of the bad boy, actually. He could have gone, he was at the Oxford Union, and when he would argue one side, but he could as easily have argued the other side. He was trained that way. That's the way his mind worked. The dialectic is what mattered to him. But the positions he took, even if you don't concur with them, or they seem to depart from a certain kind of left liberal position, in fact, he took them because he believed them, he meant them, and he thought, and I agree with him in this, but that doesn't matter what I think, they were consistent. That is, say what you might about Iraq, he saw that as a liberation movement. He was an internationalist. He believed in bringing democracy to the world, and he thought the U.S. had been involved in Iran and Iraq in the most heinous and criminal way from the 1953 overthrow of Mossadegh all the way. I don't have to give you the whole history. And here, Now there was an attempt to overthrow a terrible despot and liberate the country and bring a democratic movement. It may not have been executed well, it may have failed, you may not agree with it, but he really believed it, and that's why he supported it. It was not so that he could be contrary or to realign himself in a way that he would be perceived as, you know, unpredictable. So I don't think he ever tried to cultivate the bad boy image, and I don't think he was a bad boy.
I will say that he did have a flair for showmanship, and it wasn't lost on him what the reputation served.
That's true.
Well, he did say once that the thought of preventive war gave him an erection.
That what, sorry?
That the thought of preventive war gave him an erection.
Oh. Yeah, he was just,
That's a bit of a glib remark.
Yeah, I didn't remember that one.
Thank you.
But as for Kissinger, I don't think he's done with him because they've reissued his book, The Trial of Henry Kissinger, and it's more relevant now than it ever has been, I think, because an official biography of Kissinger is about to come out by Neil Ferguson. And I noticed the other day Kissinger returned to Harvard, where I guess the students hadn't been all that thrilled to have him for some time. And Ferguson wrote a piece in which he said it was so wonderful the students welcomed Kissinger back. They applauded him. They didn't hound him off the campus. It was as if the 60s never happened. It's just so wonderful. So keep an eye out for that book and try and get a hold of, if you haven't read, The Trial of Henry Kissinger by Christopher Hitchens, which is the rebuttal to this authorized biography.
Oh, hi. I was wondering, for each of you, if you could pick out a common thread that runs out throughout his body of work. He very much, my impression is that he very much cared to be genuine and to be accurate about the human condition. And what do you think would be the common thread?
Well, we were asked this, friends of Hitch were asked this by Charlie Rose, and I thought that James Fenton, the poet, made a very good, he said he was basically a street-fighting lefty. And I think it was sort of lefty passions that led him to endorse Iraq. It was the idea of liberating, and he had a special passion and feeling for the Kurds, and who have been true beneficiaries of the invasion. I've always thought he had sort of an impulsiveness in his thinking that made him at certain times of his life susceptible to ideology. And I always think that your ideology should be no ideology. And until 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union, I thought Hitch was very constrained in his writing because, and he said to me, he didn't like this thesis of mine, but he said, well, it's true, you do get tired of raising your scarred dukes to defend Trotsky. So he was susceptible to that, but basically almost the passion of a teenage boy for freedom and justice in that sort of street-fighting lefty way, and the heat that he would generate in his talk. I mean, I went to the Occupy protest in Tampa during the Republican National Convention, and I thought, this is so tame. I thought, where is the Hitchens of this movement? Where is that fire, that lefty heat? At such a time in American politics when all the democracy is being attacked by money and lies and voter suppression, and it just wasn't there. It's been bred out of the American youth. And I remembered the sort of passion that Hitch would get going when he felt justice was threatened, and that wasn't there.
Well, I think also he and many people believe of all his talents, his oratory talents were perhaps his finest, and he's been referred to as perhaps the greatest orator of our generation. I don't know who among you saw him speak, but he would love to have a room like this, and he could probably get you to follow him anywhere.
Martin, can I ask a question? Why do you think he never tried to write fiction?
Well, I've often talked to my novelist friends, all of whom were riveted by Christopher. And he certainly had, he had the phrase-making ability. He could dream himself into another person, and he could. He had, many of the prerequisites for it. But Ian McEwan said, he said, I think he just didn't want to spend his time doing what we do, which is making up, imagining things, making up people, telling these artful lies, which is what we do. He was too straight for that.
I would also say that you can see the gift that would sort of naturally lend itself toward narrative writing in the first chapters, the first 3 chapters of Hitch 22 in particular, where he writes about his family history, I think stand alongside the finest autobiography I've read anywhere.
Well, also, we worked on wrote a couple scripts together, which he didn't like doing that all that much, but he was very inventive, and his dialogue was extraordinary. I think you're right. I think ultimately, if he'd lived a long time, he wanted to write about Proust and who knows what else, and he certainly was more interested in literary examination than just polemics and politics. Who knows if he would have gotten around to it, but I don't think he wanted to, as you say, to spend that much time inhabiting an imaginary universe.
And fiction makes nothing happen. Yeah. And there was always this, the possibility that what he wrote, his rhetoric, his oratorical brilliance would bring about change. And a novel, something's gone badly wrong when a novel sort of interferes with the real life, like
Salman's book.
Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses. It's a category error when politics latches onto a novel.
I want to pick up one quick thing on the issue of the common thread that runs through the work, where this idea that liberty or liberation, as you put it, was sort of run straight through, but it wasn't only just for liberal causes, because Christopher would of course defend people who had opinions wildly opposed to his own, their right to profess those opinions.
He believed in an absolute First Amendment, and he loved the Bill of Rights, and that's why he became an American citizen.
Yeah.
Well, one last question.
That was the cause of his life.
Good afternoon. My name is David Weeder. I'm a local resident, and I was present at the Temple-Israel debate. And I'm an attorney, but I had never, ever seen such blazing rhetorical skills. I just couldn't believe what I was hearing, especially the remark about the wheelchair. On the other hand, I did see him on television one day, and he was plainly less than sober. He was really 2 sheets to the wind.
I never noticed that.
And I couldn't believe that he was able to maintain his train of thought. I certainly couldn't have.
Well, sorry.
I just can't, So I was just reading, this is just a comment, I was just starting to read this biography that just came out, the 3rd volume of the Churchill trilogy by William Manchester, and I think his name is Paul Reed. And the first chapter deals with Churchill plainly drunk. Most of the time he was working. He just kept drinking and working and dictating. And it seemed to me that that's what Christopher did with quite a lot of frequency. And I just wondered if you wanted to confirm or deny that.
I would deny it, because he was almost never drunk, sometimes at 3 in the morning, but almost never. He calibrated, and he had his pre-lunch drink and some wine with lunch and some wine. He basically had a whole system for how much he would have, and his mind was quite sober when he was writing.
I know the period you mean, and it was I think it was after one of his more sort of controversial decisions, which was to out Sid Blumenthal of Clinton's staff, and I rang him up. He was getting a lot of pain from that. And I rang him up and I said, how are you? And he said, I'm living in a world of pain, he said. This had been such an unpopular thing to do. And he believed it was right, and he defended it in Hitch really too. But again, this is part of his great appeal, I think, that not being on TV drunk. And I saw him drunk in over 40 years. I saw him drunk twice.
Yeah, he was probably very
I
tired.
was drunk a lot of the time. I was drunk sort of several hundred times, but he was never drunk.
Yeah, I would say, Martin, I think I've probably noticed 2 or 3 times late at night in 25 years.
Very tired, and
But I just wanted to comment about the rhetorical skills being very Churchillian, in my opinion.
I think better than that.
No, Churchill was good.
And what is your relationship to this person?
I often thought he had many things in common with Churchill, including courage. And it was said, I inverted that Nabokovian thing. Nabokov said, I think like a genius, I write like a distinguished man of letters, I talk like a child. And I said, Hitch, it's the other way around. He talks like a genius, writes like a distinguished man of letters, and thinks like a child. Well, and they often said of Churchill that he thought like a child, that his mind was sort of whizzing around all over the place, and plus the rhetorical skills and the courage. Very like that.
Well, I really do miss him. He was one of my heroes.
Thank you very much. And thank you. Let's have a hand for our guests.
Thank you to our authors, and the autographing area is to the right of the elevators as you leave this room.
And you're watching Book TV's live coverage from the Miami Book Fair International. You're just watching Carol Blue, Carrie Goldstein, and Martin Amis talking about their erstwhile colleague, friend, and husband, Christopher Hitchens. And we're here in Chapman Hall, and Carol Blue is working her way back to our corner here in Chapman Hall, where she'll be answering some of the Facebook and Twitter comments that we've received for her. We've got a few minutes. If you do have a chance and you want to make a comment following this panel, go ahead and tweet it to us at